ora tātou. I'm Brennan Rigby from the Shift Aotearoa. Thanks for listening in to this another interview in what was the series from VisionWeek in June here in Aotearoa, but we're just carrying on with this series of really interesting interviews. So hopefully, if you want to learn something about housing in Aotearoa, you will have found some really great resources. Today I am talking with Sarah Jameson from Aotearoa, but currently in France, and the context for this interview really is that we're going to talk about our experiences of COVID, and I guess we're going to try and focus on housing in that. But to stay true to the series of interviews that I've been doing, we're also going to then move into talking about a vision for the future and thinking about what needs to change. And Sarah, having the background that she has, may do that in an international context and may touch on the Aotearoa context too. But either way, I'm looking forward to the interview. So I'll pass it over to you, Sarah, to introduce yourself and we'll get underway.
Okay, thank you, and kia ora. As Brennan said, I'm from Aotearoa, but I'm currently based in France. I came over here to pursue a Master's in Human Rights and Humanitarian Action, which I've just completed. And it was through that really that I discovered that what I'm really passionate about is the right to housing and economic and social cultural rights more broadly, but specifically housing. And throughout my Master's, it was the main topic I kept coming back on and wanting to write about was the right to housing in New Zealand. And that's how I got in touch with Brennan, because I wrote quite a bit on that, and I'm really passionate about seeing change happen in New Zealand in the housing sphere. So I'm a lawyer by training and background, and with a brief stint as a policy analyst. I worked for the government in New Zealand before I came to France. And yeah, really excited to be connected with the Shift Aotearoa and to talk about making change.
Awesome. Kia ora, Sarah. Thanks for that intro. Very kind of you as well. We're excited. Just for full disclosure, Sarah randomly out of the blue sent us a theory of change for the Shift Aotearoa about 3 weeks ago, and it's awesome. And reading it was just a real breath of fresh air. So thanks, Sarah, for that. And thanks for joining me this morning. So let's talk about COVID and what the impact of COVID has been on either the right to housing or what's been happening in your community. Or what was your experience of COVID?
Well, obviously, full disclosure, I can't comment on the New Zealand context because I was based in France.
And of course, I'm using the past tense because we're kind of getting back to normal, and that may not be the case where you are, of course.
So we're facing a second wave, and we don't know if we're going to lock down again. I think they announced in France today that a full-scale lockdown like we had back in, it seems like a lifetime ago, but back in March, April, they're not going to do that again just because it was catastrophic for the economy. So I don't know, watch this space. But on a personal level, and I've been talking about this quite a bit because obviously I've been starting to see friends again who've returned to Paris since the whole lockdown ended. And they've asked what our experience of lockdown was. And it's at risk of sounding cliched, lockdown on a personal level was fine for me. And that really reinforced how privileged I am. My wife and I live in a really beautiful, really light apartment with everything we need. And we had a landlord that was able to be flexible in terms of our rent payments. My wife her working hours got reduced, but the French government has topped up the pay, so it doesn't really affect her pay. So we just got into a really lovely routine of working from home together, and then we live in a really lovely street with a nice community feel, and everyone at 8 o'clock every evening would open the windows, and there was singing and there was music, so that was really lovely. So I can't talk about, that was honestly my experience of the lockdown, but I'm aware that is just how immensely lucky I was that I was in that position, because that was not the reality for a large number of people. So I know in France, specifically in relation to housing, in France with rental laws, they have this provision where your landlord cannot evict you for several months of the year over the winter period, which is quite long. It's like a 4-month period. Even if you don't pay the rent, they cannot kick you out over this period. And I know that while COVID's been happening, or the lockdown was happening, that period has been extended until I think the end of August at this stage. So even if you cannot pay the rent, you don't pay the rent, the landlord at the moment cannot evict you, and they can't put any pressure on you. So that's really good. I think I was still keeping on top of what was happening in New Zealand with relation to housing, and how measures were quite quickly taken to get emergency housing up and running. That's the wrong turn of phrase, but it's just, I don't know. I was talking to my sister about it, and we were just saying that it shows when there is political will, it is possible to do something about the housing situation. It's just seeing this political will to actually deal with the hard issues and deal with possibly political issues and find long-term solutions outside of crisis time, maybe is lacking.
That seems like a pretty good synopsis. I mean, certainly the emergency housing and Housing First funding and resources seem to be ramped up during the period, but and we think there's been some maybe light commitments from government to say, yeah, we understand that people who were housed during COVID can't really just be unhoused any time. I mean, there needs to be a transition into secure tenure out of these kind of emergency and transitional situations. And so from a human rights perspective, what are some of the things that you've noticed? You've mentioned already the extension on evictions in France, and also the fact that the French government, like the New Zealand government, topped up pay where pay had been impacted by COVID. What are some of anything else you've noticed on the international scene in terms of human rights that's noteworthy?
I think one thing that struck me, because I was carrying on with my studies during lockdown, and the class I was taking on economic, social and cultural rights, the lecturer made the decision to turn a lot of that into a discussion about COVID and human rights and what that means. And there's been a fair amount of discussion about how COVID is really a turning point, and it's kind of where things that have previously been shelved as impossible can be on the table, and it's a time for new thinking as well. And it's really important that we don't just let this moment pass, and the world doesn't do what it did after the 2008 financial crash, which is austerity and cuts to public services, cuts to social security, cuts to social services, and which have a disastrous impact on economic, social and cultural rights. So it's really important that we seize this opportunity for a sort of human rights reset, I think has been some of the language that's being used, and really actually take this time to think of, okay, what sort of, because we need to, there's this talk about building back better, And what does that mean? We don't want to return to normal, because returning to normal for New Zealand is where you've got one of the highest rates of homelessness in the OECD, where you've got about 1,600, I think the statistic is, of people dying each year as a result of poor quality housing. And we don't want to go back to normal. So I think definitely in my human rights classes, there was lots of discussion as, okay, so what does this moment mean in terms of being a kind of climate where we can think about creating change and think about new possibilities. So yeah, I think for me, that's definitely been a big thing for me in terms of the lockdown, and going forward is really just thinking about, okay, so how do we want to do things going forward?
I've been thinking about this kind of building back better term or turn of phrase, which I sort of, for me, it has a lot of underpinnings of, it makes me think about infrastructure for some reason, and I don't really know why that is, but it feels to me like, there's kind of risks on all sides, right? And initially a lot of people were talking about the opportunity that COVID presents, and personally I felt really uncomfortable with that blatant language of making an advantage out of the crisis. And I like the way you framed it and your lecture framed it in terms of, maybe it's not an opportunity, maybe it's just a turning point. I think that's a nicer and calmer way to kind of talk about it. But then there's this kind of there's a lot of different, as we talked about yesterday, Sarah, there's a lot of different strategic drivers, isn't there, kind of trying to latch onto this post-COVID period, or let's say intra-COVID period that we're in globally, and building back better is one idea, but I worry that it's maybe getting a little bit attached to the existing commercial and capitalist interests that prevailed prior to COVID. Is that, what's your sense on that? Do you have, am I does that make sense? And do you
have... it absolutely does. And I'm not sure what I think about that particular expression, but if I was going to be optimistic, I would say that COVID has really highlighted how important public services and social services and community services, and basically services which might not be provided by the state but are provided in the public interest and for public good, how important they are and how crucial they are. And so part of me would like to be an optimist and think that surely you've got the Tory government in the UK acknowledging the value of the public health system, which is systematically slashed for the past decade. So I don't know, I hope this does lead to a shift in consciousness about the importance of looking after each other, and which sounds a bit cliched, but I don't know, like there is this part of optimistic part of me that wonders, well, surely this is a massive wake-up call against privatisation. But then, I don't know, then on other days I'm a bit more cynical and a bit more negative. So,
yeah. No, I hear you. It's a little bit of a roller coaster, isn't it? And
yeah.
And I have this, that's a beautiful expression of, I think, something a lot of people will be experiencing at the moment, as a certain sense of optimism at times, pessimism at other times, and probably, if they're anything like me, Sarah, and maybe a little like you, there's a good dash of cynicism in there as well about whether we can actually change. But I'll add another thing in there, which is a little bit of guilt. Like, I think there's when we talk about, and to put it really, completely oversimplified, we kind of allowed neoliberalism and individualism to take over in the 80s and 90s and since then. And I think a lot of us knew that our communities were hurting and our communities were being compromised by that, and probably didn't know what to do about that, and didn't feel like there was a way to do anything about that. And COVID, certainly in our context, I had a similar experience to you, which was, I went walking with my family every morning in a beautiful neighbourhood on the foothills of the Waitakere Ranges in West Auckland. I saw more of my kids than I'm ever likely to see again, to be honest, 5 weeks at home with them. But actually that was a little bit the re-emergence of community. And just to kind of add on to that, I had a very interesting conversation last week about food security, and someone was talking about a project in which they were trying to get their community into growing food, and they just said this completely off the hand comment, which was, and you know what, we managed to find a guy who knew how to grow his own food, and so he's been helping us. And it was at that moment that I kind of went, wow, you were working with a community and you found one guy who could grow his own food. That's actually terrifying.
Yeah.
But I guess I'm trying to just surface that importance of community. And I guess that feels like something different from building back better. Now I'm just telling you what I think instead of you telling me what you think.
No, it's really interesting. To be honest, I did a lot of thinking about this idea of community, because I really saw, we've got to know so many more of our neighbours as a result of COVID. And so the street that we live on has 2 annual street parties. And since COVID and everyone's got to know each other, as soon as gatherings of more than 10 were permitted again, the street's been having street parties every second week, and it's been really, really lovely. And then there has been this spirit and ethos of helping each other out and things like that. But we had a discussion about that in the class I mentioned earlier, about the notions of community and solidarity. And there was a girl from the UK who said, I'm really quite skeptical of people talking about helping each other out. And I think specifically she had a problem with the kind of narrative that was being spun by the Tory government in the UK about helping each other out and being there for each other. And her issue with that was, well, why should it be up to us as individuals to provide a safety net for each other? Why shouldn't the state be providing that for us? Or why should there not be sufficient? I think she was taking issue with the fact that there have been so many cuts to public and social and community services over the past decades, but yet here's this language of helping each other out. And she was quite angry about it, and it kind of really made me think. And we've got some friends here, and one of them is a doctor who works in the emergency services. So obviously COVID was a very busy time, and like I think happened in a lot of countries, at 8 p.m. every night we would clap outside our window for the health service, and his wife and children would do that as well. But they also had this massive sign that in French it rhymes, in English it doesn't rhyme, so it won't sound good, but it basically means more money for public hospitals. In French it actually sounds really cool and rhymes, but yeah, they would just have that banner outside. But I think it's just, again, it's like almost that roller coaster of emotions. It's kind of like these tensions between these two ideas and trying to unpack how you feel about them all. And when you think about them in terms of human rights, like what does that mean in terms of state obligations versus, or not versus, and in addition to basically alternative way of doing things that are community based and are built from the ground up and are built in common with our neighbours. So yeah, it's a really interesting time to think about all these ideas, but then at the same time I feel really guilty for saying it's an interesting time to think about these ideas, because I acknowledge that the fact that I'm in a position where I can say it's good to think about these ideas makes me incredibly privileged. So yeah, that's a big ramble, sorry.
No, we accept your acknowledgement. That's, you know, I mean, it is, and I think there's a certain, you know, you're making an acknowledgement that I think possibly isn't being made enough in New Zealand, which is, you know, we need to be very, as happened at the start of this interview, I just set off talking about kind of a post-COVID environment, but actually the rest of the world is, you know, deeply engaged in that specific struggle right now. And so it's, you know, it's important to acknowledge those things. But just going back to your doctor, it's interesting because there's this political tension, isn't there, between the civic desire to celebrate our emergency service workers with this 8 p.m. Ritual, and the political lid on that, which is everybody actually wants to use that opportunity to create some pressure on the government to fund things in a different way. And right in the middle of that, there's this cohort of people who are doctors and nurses who are kind of very much spotlighted, and maybe what I imagine would be quite an awkward position. And people like Julie and a good friend of mine, Moira Lawler, who's, you know, was until recently a senior leader in an NGO, who I just always felt this real aroha for, because they were always stuck between the operational delivery of their organisations and the need to do great things for human beings on stretched resources, but to every day go and do their best and get their staff to do their best. And then at the same time, occasionally go to Wellington and put a different hat on and be the advocate for more resources and for different systems, and for and it's sort of a tough place to be. I wonder if we can just cap that off, because I'm conscious, just for if anyone ever listens to this, for your information, it's kind of late for Sarah at the moment over in France. But can you tell me just briefly, and the answer might be no, and I'm sorry that if I put you in that position, but can you, is there, are there human rights in community?
That's
tell me what the status of that is.
Human rights in community.
Yeah.
So as in things being commonly owned, and
or is there kind of a human right tied to the idea of I have a right to live in a community, or I have a right to live in a community that is culturally appropriate for me, or something like that? Is there anything like that, or is it? Maybe we should reconvene on that question when you've had a chance to.
There are. Okay, so I don't think there's a specific human right to live in a community, but there's definitely things that. So, like, take housing, for example. Part of the right to adequate housing is about location and where it is, and whether it is acceptable to you in terms of, from a cultural perspective, and also in terms of being near essential services. So there's that. But then I think there's also some really interesting thinking that's kind of nascent, I guess, at the moment, which is about the human rights in the commons, which is this notion, like, because traditionally human rights have been about the relationship between states and individuals. That's the way they've always been framed. But if we were to think beyond that state-individual relationship, are there alternatives? Like, so there's been lots of writing about how privatisation is really damaging to human rights, how privatisation of services like housing, like education, is incompatible with human rights requirements. And the obviously opposite to that is state housing or public education. But are there alternative ways of doing things, like obviously community housing and social housing? But then what's the relationship between human rights and things that are community owned and things that arise out of the community? And I'm only just starting to explore that, so I actually don't know. So I think that is a question I'd like to read on in more detail further and discuss later. But definitely in the right to housing, that definitely having location definitely comes into it. But I guess it depends on what you define by community and what that extends to. But I definitely feel, to refer back to what we were saying earlier, that is something that's, I think, well, if you're lucky enough to have experienced lockdown the way you and I have, we saw this kind of re-emergence of community that's gone. And I think that, definitely think that warrants further thinking. But I'm going to have to be honest, I can't say categorically one way or the other. I think if you read the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, I think there might be something in that. But it's not expressed in that way, but I think you could find things related to that. And I think there are things related to, I think, that you can relate to community, but whether there's a right to live in a community, I don't know.
So it sounds like something that could be worth us doing some research on. Anyway, I guess, sorry to have put you on the spot with that question, but it's really interesting. Very articulate answer, and of course, I guess what I'm experiencing through this period of engagement on guidelines on the right to a decent home, which we're doing in Aotearoa, thanks to the Human Rights Commission, but also through the Shift Aotearoa, is we are trying to take this kind of systemic approach to the question of housing, and following Leilani's movement, the Shift, that is about the human right to housing as a mitigating factor of capitalism. And in the New Zealand context, the Shift Aotearoa, we're funded by the Peter McKenzie Project, which is all about reducing child poverty. So human rights plus reducing financialisation plus reducing poverty is really what the Shift Aotearoa is about. My point being that I literally don't know how far we can progress that without talking about food security, functioning strong communities, which nurture and create and provide resilience, and of course communities are also a function, to a certain extent, I think, of secure tenure. And that's one of the critical things that's happened in New Zealand, of course, is with the supply problems and the state housing supply problems that we've had over the last 20, 30 years, is that, the typical story is that people's tenancies are less than 2 years, and it's immediately clear how destructive that is of community.
Yeah.
So there we go. We've solved that, and so there's 4 years of work ahead right there, which is exciting. So listen, I'm conscious that I'm gonna want to let you go in a moment, and I do hope that we can reconvene on these questions. But listen, I'll just do a quick little wrap up. I don't think I'm going to try and wrap up on the subject matter itself, but just in terms of wrapping up the interview and the recording. And that'll just give you 30 seconds to think about, because even though this isn't part of Vision Week anymore, I'm super interested in your articulation of what your hopes and vision for the future of housing is, or for the future of the right to housing, and feel free to hit the international or the Aotearoa context. So I'll just do my little wrap up and I'll come back to you, Sarah. So kia ora everyone, thanks for listening into this interview with Sarah Jamieson. Do you say Jamieson or Jameson?
It's Jameson.
Jameson. Okay, awesome.
Everyone in New Zealand gets it wrong. It's really interesting. The French can do it, but people in New Zealand go Jamison, but the French are fine.
Right. It sounds like Te Reo Māori, you know, when you speak to people from other countries, they seem to be able to pronounce it no problem. But
yeah,
it seems tricky. So kia ora, Sarah, and thanks so much for your time. I appreciate you staying up. Just for listeners' information, Sarah and I were also on a call about 15 hours ago.
Yeah.
So awesome. Thanks, Sarah, and thanks for your input to the shift Aotearoa. The theory of change is really amazing, and so great conversation with Sarah about sort of the impact of COVID on housing and community, and so I'm just going to pass it back over to Sarah to, as briefly as you wish, talk about where to next, and what do you think? I mean, now I'm loath to use the word opportunities, so I won't use it. Where to next, and what do you think the next steps could be for us, either in New Zealand or globally, in terms of the right to housing?
Well, in the New Zealand context, my big hope for the next few years, I think I framed it in my theory of change as a midterm goal, is that housing actually, there is this shift in ethos that whereby housing is actually conceived of as a fundamental human right, because it is. And I think in New Zealand, we've really lost touch with that idea a long time ago, when housing became the investment strategy of choice. And my hope is that it stops being seen as your, I guess piggy bank, and actually gets reconnected with the idea of a home. And I really like the way that the shift has framed the discussions around the right to a home, rather than the way it's framed under international human rights law, which is adequate housing. Because I think when you connect it with this idea of home, you connect more with what it means to be human, which is, and connect housing back with something to which we're all entitled by virtue of being human. And so I guess my long-term goal would be that everyone in Aotearoa, regardless of economic status, has a place to live in security and dignity. That's going to take many years, so I think in the short to mid-term, my hope and vision is that we do get this shift in ethos, and we do actually start championing housing as a human right, and frame it in the terms it warrants and deserves. And I think that's a really important first step in how we achieve change in housing in New Zealand. So I'm really excited. I'm really excited about the work that the Shift Aotearoa is doing on the guidelines. I think I'm really excited by the project. I saw it on Twitter, and I may have given a little squeal. But, so that is my vision, that we get housing reframed in the public consciousness as a human right.
Awesome. Kia ora, Sarah. Can I just ask one more question too, because you got your legal background in human rights, and I know that I promised to only ask you one more question, but there you go. How do you think New Zealand deals with human rights at the moment?
Okay, well, in factual terms, New Zealand's ratified both the Covenant, which is like a big international treaty on civil and political rights, and on economic, social and cultural rights. It's incorporated civil and political rights into New Zealand domestic law through the Bill of Rights Act. It hasn't done so with economic, social and cultural rights. So that's things like housing, it's also education, it's also water, it's also food, it's also social security. If I'm being quite frank, I think New Zealand likes to think it's very good at human rights. I think if you take a hard look at what the reality is today, I don't think it's really got that much to be proud about, and I don't think it can call itself a leader in human rights when you've got such disproportionate outcomes for Māori, and you've got the highest, in 2018 I think it was, the highest homelessness rate in the OECD. You're not, I've ranted about this a lot, but there's a book, it's written, I think it's a few years old now, but it's Human Rights in New Zealand, Emerging Fault Lines by Sylvia Bell and Judy McGregor, and they basically note, and I didn't realise this, that the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which is an international, it's one of the human rights organs of the UN, and they recommended that New Zealand incorporate economic and social cultural rights into New Zealand domestic law twice now. And New Zealand has said, no, I don't think we really need to. And I would argue that you do need to, because I do think recognising something in domestic law is a really important first step in the sense that it empowers rights holders, and it gives rise to accountability on behalf of the government. And I really think New Zealand doesn't take economic, social, cultural rights seriously, and I think it's really time that it started.
Thank you, Sarah. Amazing answer. You've given me the factual answer, and I hope another time, at a more reasonable time of day, we can maybe get your personal answer as well. But
you can get after I've had my first coffee, and then I'll be ranting away.
Yeah. So look, a lot to think about, and thank you. And I to let you know, I'm sort of thinking about. I won't talk with you about it. We'll talk about strategy sometime, and just so anyone in New Zealand or internationally knows, I'm the leader of the Shift, project lead of the Shift Aotearoa, and I'm extremely thankful that Sarah Jameson has suddenly started contributing to this project, because she's got really great experience and insights into it. So I'm not going to let her insights slip away. I hope that's...
Well, I'm really excited by the work being done in this area. I've been a huge fan of Leilani, who's the former UN Special Rapporteur on the right to housing. I've been a huge fan of her work ever since I discovered her a year ago, and been reading her reports, including her end of mission statement to New Zealand, which is a must read. And so I've been following her work on the Shift. So when I found out about the Shift Aotearoa, I was super excited, and I really care passionately about improving and making a change in respect to the housing situation in Aotearoa, even though I'm currently trapped in France, but and so super excited to be involved.
Awesome. Kia ora, Sarah. I'll let you go, but just as a reference for any listeners, Leilani's end of mission statement is available in various places, including on the Human Rights Commission website. And her final report on her mission to New Zealand, which was in February this year, is going to be presented to the UN in Geneva in March next year. So we'll be looking forward to that as well. I'm sure Sarah will go along and clap from the balcony. Yeah,
if we're not in lockdown number 3 by then.
Oh, that's right. All right. Well, kia ora. Thank you very much again, Sarah. And I'll stop the recording, and I'll let you go and have a late evening to yourself.
Cool. Kia ora, Brandon.
All right. Kia ora, Sarah. Talk soon.